Welcome back, everyone. Again, Dr. James Broomall with Steve Bockmiller. And two of the key elements to the story is going to be clothing and money. And so one of the things that's interesting about an environment like this is that it changes over time. And so we're going to see an absence of buildings and a reconstruction of another building. And we're going to see a changing historical landscape, which we're going to also deal with over monocracy later in our program. But with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Steve, who's going to introduce us to these spaces and the people that inhabited them historically.
Thank you. We're standing in front of two important locations that were adjacent to one another that played into the story. Both buildings are no longer here. One was torn down in the 1930s and the other one was actually quite recently. Where we have the opening here was the location of George Updegraff's hat store. And next to it, where that large Georgian or colonial revival looking building is there, which was originally built in the 1930s as a Montgomery Ward store, replaced the building that was there during the Civil War, which was the Hagerstown Bank. Hagerstown Bank was the most prominent bank in Washington County at the time. Its president was James Dixon Roman, the congressman who has been brought in to help negotiate the situation. Now, it's important to understand this site. Keep in mind that this block of West Washington Street is basically where the Confederate wagons were lined up to accept all of the clothing that was rounded up, etc. And a lot of what happened played out here. For example, the bank and its board of directors, they were willing to help out. The problem is that their job is to protect the interests of their shareholders and their depositors. They weren't in the business of just doling out thousands of dollars as a civil good.
Right.
That was an awful lot of money back then. So what ended up happening was they had to make arrangements with the town in order to guarantee their interest in getting their money back. They were willing to help, but they needed to make sure they were going to be repaid. Now keep in mind this was all completely illegal at the time. What they arranged for with the town city council was that the city council would go around and get pledges from prominent citizens of both political parties to make very sure it was a nonpartisan situation, and get pledges for money to essentially co-sign a loan to the city to pay the ransom. So what ends up happening is the banks, Hagerstown Bank and two others, lent the $20,000 to the city government. The city government went around and got co-signers to co-sign pieces of that $20,000. So if the city couldn't figure out how to repay the bank, then those people who co-signed the loans would be on the hook for it. So luckily what would happen is very quickly after this all transpired in the latter part of 1864, the town government got together with their representatives in Annapolis, and the state legislature passed a law that allowed the city of Hagerstown to issue bonds to pay back the banks and everybody who lost money during this event. And then the town would then have a tax that would pay that bond off over about 20 years.
I think what's important to note there is that this is the long legacy of the Civil War. So decades after the fact, the town's still economically impacted by the events of 1864.
Exactly. It was a situation where it was very complex. I jokingly refer to, when I give a talk on this, I said, I'm going to give you a lecture on municipal bond financing in Civil War Maryland, which of course people's eyes would glaze over. People get the impression that it was a situation where they ran around with baskets just asking people for money, which was it was not the case.
Right.
So ultimately the town was reimbursed, or the town banks were reimbursed through the bond process, which occurred in early 1865. Now with Updegraff's hat store, this is very representative of what also happened here, because the town could not possibly come up with 1,500 complete sets of men's clothing.
Right.
And there was a negotiation, which I spoke of earlier, where the town leaders and the bank would not tell the citizens that the Confederates agreed to take all of the clothing that they could be rounded up in that amount of time. Because they said, if you're going to expect the impossible of us, we're not going to cooperate with you. You might as well just start burning the town. So there was this clandestine arrangement, and the town provided a large amount of clothing, just not anywhere near the 1,500 complete sets. And a lot of those things kind of varied depending on what the item was. There was an awful lot of hats that were collected. And the reason being is that there was two hat stores here in Hagerstown, one of which was Updegraff's, where the owner did not have the foresight to pack up his inventory and get up into Pennsylvania to avoid the Confederates. As a result, Mr. Updegraff's entire inventory was completely cleaned out. including the hat on his own head. An eyewitness account said that he was loading hats into the Confederate wagons, and a Confederate soldier came up and literally picked the hat right off of Mr. Updegraff's head. So the interesting thing is with this building, unfortunately it had to be demolished just because it was too far gone. It had sat vacant for a number of years. This area here is actually in process of being developed as an extension of Hagerstown's Cultural Arts Trail.
Okay.
And that reaches from the from Antietam Street down to City Park.
Right.
It's being extended from Antietam Street up here to Washington Street past the District Court building. As part of the design of the park, as an educational tool, what the city is doing is we're going to be rebuilding the front facade of that building using the same window pattern. We even took specific measurements before it came down of what the building looked like when it was originally built in the 1820s and 30s as a two-story building. The third floor that was on the building that people might remember up until the time it was demolished was built just prior to the Civil War.
Okay.
So when this park is dedicated later this year, we're going to have a two-story facade that connects these buildings, and will be an educational tool to help explain the history of the site. We can use the historic photographs from the Civil War period of Updegraff's store and what it looked like, and then use the actual rebuilt facade to show what it originally looked like before the third floor went onto it.
Interesting. I think, what I would note is, as we've been going through the town today, it's remarkably well marked. And so the history of the town is quite literally emblazoned upon the landscape, largely because of your efforts. And the town itself is doing much to preserve in some form, at least elements of its past. And so again, for those of you who haven't visited Hagerstown, Maryland, it's a highly recommended visit, certainly on your way from Antietam to Gettysburg, or perhaps on your way over to Monocacy. This is definitely one of the stops you'll want to make. And as we'll continue to go through the town, we're going to see more jewels that are in this community. And so with that, we'll head to our next stop.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.